Most horror films rely on images to frighten us, shadows stretching down a dark hallway, a scream echoing through an empty room, a monster finally stepping into the light. But every once in a while, a film unnerves us long before anything appears on screen. A sudden wave of restlessness, a faint buzz under the skin, a sense that something is wrong, even though we can't explain why. These reactions often have nothing to do with what we're watching, and everything to do with what we're hearing. Hidden beneath the orchestral swells and ambient drones, some filmmakers embedded audio experiments that pushed the boundaries of what audiences could comfortably endure. Low-frequency vibrations that disturb the inner ear. Voices stretched until they melt into ghost-like murmurs. Notes bent just far enough to confuse the nervous system. And then there are the rumors, whispers of tones that never should have been used, sound tests that left crew members feeling physically ill, and composers who later refused to revisit certain recordings. Tonight's episode explores the films where sound didn't simply accompany the horror, it triggered it. These are the movies that unsettled audiences on a biological level, creating anxiety, dizziness, or dread without a single shocking image. Whether these effects were the result of experimentation, malfunction, or something even stranger, one thing is clear. Sometimes the most terrifying part of a horror film isn't the scene you remember, it's the sound you didn't realize was there. Fact 1. The Witch Who Came from the Sea, 1976. Though The Witch Who Came from the Sea drifts through dreamlike visuals and fragmented emotion, its true impact is carried by a soundscape engineered to disturb the audience from the inside out. Rather than crafting traditional musical themes, the composer wove together fragile, unstable tones designed to mimic psychological dissolution. The score leans heavily on microtonal movement pitches that hover between established notes, creating faint, queasy harmonics. Tape flutter further destabilizes these tones, giving them the wavering quality of a memory slipping away. Viewers frequently report feeling disoriented during scenes that are visually calm, sensing an emotional imbalance they struggle to articulate. Field recordings from coastal landscapes provide the foundation of the ambience. But instead of presenting waves or wind naturally, the sound team filtered away their familiar edges, leaving behind stretched, cavernous resonances that drift like distant echoes. These textures contribute to the film's sense of internal fracture, as if the environment shares the protagonist's unraveling. Deeper still are murmured vocal lines recorded at whisper volume. Actors read fragmented monologues in trembling breaths, which were then elongated into soft, trembling currents. Though nearly imperceptible, these whispers give the film a ghostly emotional pressure, as though submerged memories are trying to pull themselves to the surface. The soundtrack album removes almost all of these experimental layers, leaving only the melodic skeleton. The theatrical mix remains the truest expression of the film's intention, a quiet, haunting descent into dissociation, carried by sound rather than image. Fact 2. Phase 4, 1974. Phase 4 imagines communication with an intelligence humanity cannot understand, and it does so through sound. The ants in this film do not speak in words. They speak in vibrations, pulses, and rhythms, and the film invites the audience to feel that communication as a physical experience. The sound design hums with alien logic. Synthetic tones flutter just below conscious hearing, pressing against the body like a presence trying to make itself known. These frequencies do not feel accidental. They feel intentional, as if the ants are testing the boundaries of perception, searching for a way inside the human nervous system. Clicks and chirps mimic speech, but with patterns too precise to be animal and too mechanical to be human. Their timing shifts subtly as the ants evolve, gradually forming a sonic language that feels uncomfortably aware of the viewer. At times, it seems to respond not to characters, but to you. Even scenes grounded in the human world are infiltrated by strange room tones, by vibrations that seem to pulse from the environment itself. Conversations happen beneath an invisible pressure, as though some intelligence is listening, evaluating, learning. By the time the film reaches its climax, the frequencies intensify, creating a sense of inevitability. The viewer does not simply watch the ants ascend, they feel the ascent, as if a new form of communication is rewiring the space around them. Phase 4 is not just about contact, it is about invasion through sound, a quiet colonization of perception itself. Fact 3. Malatesta's Carnival of Blood, 1973. At first glance, Malatesta's Carnival of Blood looks like a chaotic relic of low-budget horror, eccentric costuming, surreal imagery, and disjointed editing. But what truly cements its reputation is the film's sonic landscape, a swirling vortex of broken machinery, warped acoustics, and accidental frequencies that turn the carnival setting into a living nightmare. The sound team ventured into abandoned amusement parks at night to capture raw environmental noises. Empty metal rides groaned under temperature shifts, wind whistled through rusted frames, and loose panels vibrated with eerie resonance. These recordings were then manipulated through speed changes and reversed playback, forming looping, arrhythmic patterns that seem to circle endlessly like a ride that refuses to stop. Complicating everything were the failing reel-to-reel machines used in the studio. Their deteriorating magnetic heads produced unpredictable fluctuations, bending tones into nauseating lurches. Technicians described the equipment as possessed, generating strange sounds even when the tape was still. Rather than discarding these artifacts, the editors folded them into the mix, creating a sonic world where nothing feels stable. Adding to the disorientation are scattered whisper fragments, tiny syllables, sharp breaths, muddled mutters, panned rapidly across channels. During early screenings, viewers frequently turned around, convinced someone behind them was speaking. The film never received a proper soundtrack release, leaving each surviving print with its own slightly mutated audio profile. In the end, Malatesta's Carnival of Blood stands as a rare example of unintentional brilliance, a horror soundscape born from malfunction, decay, and the eerie music of abandoned machinery. Fact 4 Images, 1972. Images exists inside the space where sound becomes thought, where the world's noises begin blending with the mind's own fragile inventions. Robert Altman's film invites the audience into a psyche slowly fracturing, and the soundtrack acts not as accompaniment but as the audible form of that fracture. John Williams's score, stripped of the heroism he would later be known for, becomes an instrument of disorientation. Metallic scrapes, splintered chimes, and soft percussive jolts intrude on the viewer like ideas breaking through the wrong door. The music refuses to settle. It circles itself, searching for structure, finding only tension. Everyday sounds behave strangely too. Water running in a quiet kitchen becomes uncomfortably loud, as if someone has placed their ear directly beside the faucet. A door closing in another room echoes with unnatural weight. Breaths drift through spaces where no one appears to be breathing. These distortions blur reality's boundaries, making it impossible to trust what the ear perceives. And then there are the whispers, thin, trembling threads of sound woven gently into silence. They are not words, not fully, more like the shadow of a thought forming just behind the viewer. Engineers describe these sessions as unnerving. The whispers felt as though they belonged to someone standing in the room, speaking softly into the mix. Images does not terrify through spectacle. It terrifies through intrusion by letting sound seep into the viewer like a thought they did not choose to have. The horror is not external, it is internal, blooming quietly inside the mind. Fact 5. The Sentinel, 1977. Though The Sentinel is famed for its shocking finale, the film's real assault on the audience occurs through sound. Its audio design relies on techniques engineered not simply to disturb, but to interfere with the body, creating sensations viewers struggle to rationalize. The production used a device capable of generating ultra-low bass frequencies that resonate physically inside the listener. These vibrations were subtly introduced into scenes involving the apartment building's unnerving residents, giving certain moments a crushing, claustrophobic weight. Some projectionists noted that people complained of nausea even during visually calm scenes, completely unaware that subharmonic tones were at work. The soundtrack incorporates warped animal recordings, cat cries, bird calls, and goat bleats manipulated through analog tape until they lost all recognizable form. These textures drift beneath the orchestral score like distant, inhuman murmurs. Several sound technicians admitted they avoided late-night sessions because the mix left them feeling unnervingly alert. Scattered throughout are recorded creaks, taps, and shuffles taken directly from the building used during filming. These noises, left unbalanced between left and right channels, create the illusion that someone is pacing just outside the frame. The effect is subtle but deeply unsettling, heightening the film's themes of spiritual intrusion. Because many of these aggressive layers caused speaker distortion, the home media releases stripped them out. Fans who saw the theatrical run insist that the film once carried a heavier, more oppressive soundscape, one that blurred the line between supernatural dread and physical discomfort. Fact 6. The Haunting of Julia, 1977. Although The Haunting of Julia unfolds like a slow, grief-soaked mystery, its power comes from a soundscape crafted to unsettle the audience at a biological level. Instead of leaning on soaring melodies or traditional horror stingers, the film relies on delicate microtonal tensions notes positioned just far enough from harmonic stability to provoke a quiet sense of dread. Composer Colin Towns built these uneasy tones through experimental bowing techniques, dragging the bow with uneven pressure across the strings to produce shimmering, trembling frequencies. These elements were placed beneath even the most subdued scenes, creating an undercurrent of emotional distortion. Musicians involved in the sessions said certain passages made their skin prickle, as though the sound itself were breathing too close. The Sandive the Mountain, end quote. The sound team layered and processed child voice textures, not as melodies, but as air-like whispers, stretched into long, wavering tones. These recordings were so faint that engineers reportedly experienced mild vertigo during prolonged mixing sessions. To deepen the domestic tension, ambient noise was captured directly from household structures: the faint rattle of vents, the vibration of window frames, the hum of aging appliances. Instead of polishing these imperfections, the team wove them into the soundtrack, making the house feel sentient, almost reactive. Most of these experimental layers were removed from the commercial soundtrack release, leaving only the surface-level music. What survives in the original theatrical mix is a rare kind of emotional manipulation, a soundscape that mimics the quiet collapse of a grieving mind, whispering discomfort long before the ghosts appear. Fact 7. The Nightcomers, 1971. Although The Nightcomers is rarely labeled a horror film, its sound design reveals an unnerving intention to unsettle the viewer not through jump scares or ghosts, but through precision-crafted unease embedded within its acoustics. Much of the film's tension emerges from the contrast between its calm visuals and the quiet distortions humming underneath. The production recorded atmospheric sound inside old stone estates, capturing echoes, low rumbles, and naturally unstable reverberations. These environmental imperfections were preserved and layered beneath dialogue, subtly shifting the emotional temperature of scenes. Even mundane moments feel cold, as if the house itself were harboring resentment. To enhance this effect, the crew experimented with bowed metal rods, dragging the bow at inconsistent angles to produce unstable harmonic drones. These tones were mixed at near-invisible levels, creating a persistent sense of disquiet that viewers couldn't consciously identify. The eeriest layer came from children's vocal recordings performed in chilly, uninsulated rooms. The cold caused faint tremors in their voices, which when stretched and filtered transformed into spectral, wavering textures. Engineers found the recordings unnerving, describing them as voices that sound alive but don't belong to anyone. Because The Nightcomers wasn't sold as a horror film, its audio experimentation slipped largely under the radar, but sensitive viewers often describe the same impression: a lingering dread, a feeling that something is subtly misaligned. Its true horror lies not in what it shows, but in the quiet, vibrating distortions that haunt its sonic space. Fact 8. Let's Scare Jessica to Death, 1971. While its dreamlike visuals and ambiguous storytelling made Let's Scare Jessica to Death an early cult favorite, the film's most corrosive horror is woven into its soundscape, a whispering, flickering environment designed to erode the viewer's sense of reality alongside Jessica's. Rather than composing a traditional score, the sound team built the film's tension from voices that never quite resolve into speech. The engineers recorded multiple performers breathing, muttering, and shaping half-words directly into close microphones. These recordings were layered and pitched into drifting clusters that slide unpredictably across channels. They never form complete sentences. Instead, they hover like intrusive thoughts, slipping into the edges of consciousness. Many viewers reported feeling watched, even when the frame remained still. The team further destabilized the atmosphere using ambient field recordings captured with failing equipment. The warping produced by aging tape heads and unstable batteries distorted natural environments into wobbling, uneven drones. These warped textures blur the line between external space and Jessica's internal unraveling. Some mixers later spoke of unexplained artifacts, phantom crackles, or breath-like noises that showed up without clear source. Instead of removing these anomalies, the team left them in, believing they contributed to the film's disorienting power. Because the film's audio stems were scattered across damaged reels, no official soundtrack release has ever captured its spectral undercurrent. Let's Scare Jessica to Death endures as one of the most intimate forms of acoustic horror, a soundscape that whispers directly into the listener's sense of sanity. Fact 9. The Legacy of Satan, 1974. At a glance, The Legacy of Satan looks like a typical low-budget slice of occult exploitation, but attentive listeners quickly discover that its most unsettling moments come not from the rituals on screen, but from the unstable audio bed lurking beneath them. Instead of building its soundscape from traditional musical cues, the production leaned heavily into the unpredictable behavior of malfunctioning synthesizers and failing tape equipment. The film's audio crew worked with machines that were already breaking down oscillators that drifted wildly in pitch, voltage-starved synthesizers prone to sputtering noise bursts, and magnetic tape prone to warping without warning. Rather than fixing these devices, the engineers embraced the chaos, recording hours of corrupted tones and wavering signals. These sonic imperfections were layered under the chanting sequences, giving the rituals a sickly, nauseating pulse that feels biologically wrong. Additional unease came from the use of chopped vocal fragments. Editors cut breaths, murmurs, and half-spoken lines into looping patterns that never fully settle into rhythm. These loops sit so low in the mix that early audiences often mistook them for real people whispering somewhere behind their seats. The film never received a proper soundtrack release, and surviving prints differ significantly in their low-end presence, implying that the film's soundscape mutated with every transfer. What remains consistent is the impression that The Legacy of Satan is stitched together from broken frequencies and electrical decay, a horror film haunted not by demons, but by its own collapsing machinery. Fact 10. Don't Look Now, 1973. Don't Look Now unsettles not through what it shows, but through what its sound quietly suggests. Venice becomes a living presence in this film, not a location, but an organism, breathing through narrow corridors and echoing canals. Every sound feels too close, too sharp, too aware of the people moving within its labyrinth. Footsteps on wet stone carry an odd intimacy, as though someone unseen is matching the characters pace for pace. Water splashes with a softness that feels wrong, as if it's absorbing secrets rather than reflecting them. Even the slightest brush of fabric seems amplified, a whisper of something approaching that never quite arrives. These textures slip beneath conscious thought, building an anxiety the viewer struggles to name. Pino Donaggio's music embraces delicate beauty, but lets it falter in strange ways. Piano notes drift away from themselves, sliding slightly out of tune, dissolving into smudged echoes as if recorded inside a fading memory. In scenes of apparent calm, the score bends just enough to make the air feel charged with hidden danger. The film's greatest trick lies in its use of silence. Silence doesn't soften anything here, it sharpens it. Within the quiet, faint noises emerge. A distant boat scraping against a dock, a muted shout swallowed by fog, a single footstep when no one is there. These sounds hover on the edge of hearing, feeding the uneasy knowledge that something is following, watching, waiting. In Don't Look Now, sound becomes prophecy. The film lets you hear dread long before you understand it, turning Venice into a whispering, warning ghost. Fact 11. The Strange Vengeance of Rosalie, 1972. Though The Strange Vengeance of Rosalie presents itself as a rural psychological thriller, its lingering discomfort owes far more to its sound design than its plot. Viewers often recall a creeping emotional pressure, a sense that something is deeply wrong even when the film shows nothing overtly frightening. That unease is rooted in the film's manipulation of ambient sound, crafted to erode the viewer's sense of stability. The audio team recorded ambient loops inside abandoned rural structures, sheds, barns, empty houses, preserving every flaw of their environment. Buzzing wires, rattling vents, accidental mic bumps. Instead of cleaning the tracks, they layered them subtly under dialogue, creating the impression of a world fraying at the edges. These textures make scenes feel contaminated, as though the location itself has absorbed something toxic. Adding to this disquiet is the film's use of irregular rhythmic pulses derived from a vintage medical training device. These beats were manipulated into off-kilter thuds that mimic, yet distort, a human heartbeat. Played at low volume, they create a subconscious tension that audiences often interpret as anxiety without knowing why. The director encouraged this approach, wanting the sound to do the emotional violence the camera wouldn't show. During early screenings, several viewers grew uneasy enough to leave the theater, convinced they had seen a horror film despite the absence of supernatural imagery. Because the audio stems were scattered and partially damaged, no soundtrack release has ever captured the film's full sonic profile. What remains is a soundscape that destabilizes quietly, a slow, creeping dread that comes not from narrative threat, but from the trembling textures beneath the surface of every scene. Fact 12. The Witching 1972. Although The Witching is often dismissed as another forgotten slice of early 70s occult cinema, its sound design hides a level of experimentation far stranger than anything happening on screen. Much of the film's uncanny presence comes from audio textures designed to sit below conscious recognition, affecting the viewer more through sensation than through identifiable sound. During post-production, the engineers experimented with metallic objects, detuned chimes, bowed steel plates, and vibrating rods, capturing tones that shimmered unpredictably. Beneath these layers, they added a pulsing, low-frequency signal produced by an aging oscillator. The tone hovered near the threshold of infrasound, the range known to unsettle the stomach and tighten the chest even when the listener can't quite hear it. One technician said he regularly felt dizzy whenever the oscillator was active. The film's most chilling ingredient may be its whispered ritual fragments. An uncredited performer recorded improvised incantations into a close microphone, their voice trembling and uneven. These lines were later warped, reversed, and stretched until they dissolved into a trembling presence, woven deep into the mix. Early viewers described a prickling sensation on the back of the neck during quiet scenes, unaware they were responding to these buried vocal remnants. Complicating matters, the original audio elements reportedly disappeared during a studio reorganization. No official soundtrack includes the film's stranger components, leaving only anecdotal evidence and surviving prints to hint at the full extent of its sonic experiments. The Witching remains a prime example of horror achieved through sound that bypasses comprehension and speaks directly to instinct. Fact 13. The Legacy 1978. Beneath the polished visuals and supernatural intrigue of The Legacy lies a soundscape woven from whispered fragments and shifting frequencies, elements designed not to be heard clearly, but to be felt. The film's elegance masks a deeply experimental approach to audio, one aimed at reaching the listener's subconscious. Composer Michael J. Lewis recorded a series of whispered passages using multiple performers, instructing them to murmur unintelligible lines in near darkness. These recordings were then carved apart, reversed, and stitched into barely audible layers that hover at the edge of perception. Sound engineers later said the sessions carried an eerie atmosphere, as if the voices refused to settle into the mix. To intensify the effect, the film employs delicate high-frequency sweeps that drift unpredictably across channels. During early screenings, certain audience members reported the uncanny sensation of someone leaning in close behind them, whispering at the edge of their ear. In at least one theater, staff reduced playback volume due to complaints of dizziness and auditory discomfort. When the official soundtrack was released, these experimental components were conspicuously missing, leaving only the orchestral score. Lewis himself admitted that revisiting the original material was emotionally draining, suggesting the recordings carried an energy he preferred not to revisit. Though its visuals tell a polished occult mystery, The Legacy's hidden achievement lies in its ability to manipulate mood through near-invisible sonic currents. Its whispers don't demand attention. They slip quietly beneath the conscious mind, shaping fear from the shadows. Fact 14. Burnt Offerings 1976. While Burnt Offerings is typically classified as a slow-burn haunted house story, its most disturbing qualities come from its sound design, a subtle yet aggressive use of low-frequency energy that lingers beneath its orchestral score. Many who saw the original 1976 theatrical run reported an inexplicable heaviness, as if the air in the room had thickened long before anything supernatural occurred. This sensation wasn't accidental. The sound team blended analog oscillator tones into the music, creating barely perceptible vibrations that resonate more with the body than the ear. Projectionists recalled bouts of fatigue and headaches during repeated screenings, while early audience members described moments of chest tightness during otherwise calm sequences. Layered into this foundation were unusual acoustic elements, bowed cymbals recorded with extreme pressure, piano strings manipulated in reverse, and whispered vocal fragments collected from multiple cast members. These textures were intentionally degraded through tapeware to give them a decayed, almost organic quality. One mixer said he found it difficult to stay in the room during long sessions, describing a suffocating sensation that seemed to radiate from the speakers. When Burnt Offerings was remixed for home media, many of these deeper layers were softened or removed, leading longtime fans to insist that the theatrical version carried a darker, more oppressive mood. The sound design doesn't merely support the narrative, it creates a shadow beneath it, an unseen presence that unsettles the audience long before the haunting begins. Fact 15. The Shout, 1978. Among the psychological horror films of the late 1970s, few manipulate sound as boldly as The Shout. While its narrative centers on a wanderer who claims to possess a lethal scream learned from tribal rituals, the true menace of the film lies in its audio design, an intricate weave of textures that seems to press directly against the viewer's senses. Instead of relying on a conventional score, the production experimented with abrasive sonic layers, distorted breathing, metallic scrapes pitched unnaturally low, and echoing vocal fragments stretched far beyond human range. Engineers working on the mix later admitted that these sessions were physically exhausting, with some describing a pulsing pressure building behind their eyes whenever the full combination played. One assistant editor said the room felt as if the oxygen shifted even at low volume. Composer Tony Banks pushed his equipment in unusual ways, reversing inhalations, layering guttural drones, and incorporating low-frequency pulses that hovered just above infrasound territory. Banks later confessed that a few recordings left him uneasy enough to avoid revisiting them, which likely explains why none of these more experimental pieces appear on the official soundtrack. In theaters, sensitive viewers often experienced a creeping sense of unease that didn't match what they were seeing on screen. The visuals remain controlled and almost understated, but the audio slips past conscious recognition, targeting the body more than the mind. The Shout endures as a reminder that horror doesn't always leap out at you. Sometimes it hums quietly beneath the surface, waiting for you to feel it. Bonus film: The Shiver of the Vampires, 1971. Among the early 70 seconds wave of psychedelic horror, The Shiver of the Vampires stands apart not because of its vivid imagery or theatrical performances, but because of a soundtrack that behaves more like an unstable organism than a composed score. Much of the film's unnerving power stems from improvised electronic sessions conducted with equipment on the verge of collapse, resulting in audio textures that shift and mutate unpredictably. The rock band Acanthus approached the soundtrack with little planning and even less technical stability. They plugged into prototype synthesizers whose circuitry was prone to fluctuation, amplifiers that crackled under voltage strain, and tape machines that slipped out of alignment without warning. During late-night recording sessions, tones would swell, bend, or vanish entirely, creating strange sonic shapes impossible to reproduce even moments later. Musicians later admitted that some sequences felt like the machines were playing themselves. Layered into this unstable bass were reversed guitar riffs fed through trembling tape loops. Each loop carried its own imperfections, dropouts, stretched segments, irregular warbles turning the melodies into smeared, ghost-like trails of sound. Engineers also captured the ambient hum of the studio's electrical wiring, filtering it into low-frequency pulses that many viewers described as physically irritating, like a vibration rising through the floor. More disquieting still are the whispered motifs woven beneath the music. These fragments, half-laughs, breathy syllables, clipped murmurs, were pushed through delay units until they dissolved into drifting, inhuman smudges. They never rise to full audibility. Instead, they flutter at the edge of perception, as if something unseen is moving just beyond the speakers. Because the audio stems were never archived and the equipment behaved differently every session, no modern release truly reflects the original soundtrack. Each transfer carries slight differences, reinforcing the belief that The Shiver of the Vampires is a product of analog chaos, a film whose sound was born from instability and can never be perfectly resurrected. If these hidden sound experiments and unsettling frequencies left you feeling a little off balance, remember, some horror doesn't need monsters or blood to crawl under your skin, and there are countless more film mysteries waiting in the dark, each carrying its own strange history and forgotten secrets. So if you want to keep descending into the obscure, the disturbing, and the beautifully unnerving corners of horror cinema, make sure you're subscribed to The Night Shriek. Leave a like, share this with someone who listens closely to the shadows, and I'll meet you again in the next unsettling discovery.